This 1898 family photo seems ordinary until you spot the hand on the shoulder. In October 2024, genealogy researcher Sarah Mitchell was conducting a routine estate appraisal in Salem, Massachusetts, when she made a discovery that would challenge everything historians thought they knew about 19th century photography. Among the belongings of the Whitmore family, who had owned the Victorian house for over a century, Mitchell found a formal family portrait dated 1898. At first glance, the sepia-toned photograph appeared completely ordinary, a typical Victorian family portrait showing 5 people arranged in their parlor. Thomas Whitmore stood behind his seated wife Mary, while their 3 children were positioned around them in the formal style of the era. However, when Mitchell examined the photograph under magnification, she noticed something impossible. A 6th hand resting on the shoulder of the youngest child, 6-year-old Margaret Whitmore. The hand appeared to belong to someone standing behind the family, yet no 6th person was visible anywhere in the frame. "I've been examining historical photographs for over 15 years, Mitchell later explained. "I've seen double exposures, plate damage, and every kind of photographic error from that period. But this was different. The hand was too clear, too deliberately positioned to be an accident." The discovery marked the beginning of an investigation that would uncover a tragic story of loss, immigration, and the psychological impact of trauma on Irish families in late 19th century America. What Mitchell had found wasn't a supernatural phenomenon, but evidence of a very human tragedy that had been forgotten by history. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, the 89-year-old descendant who was selling the family home, confirmed that the photograph had always been a source of mystery for her family. "Grandmother always said there were supposed to be 6 people in that picture," she told Mitchell, "but somehow one of them disappeared." The missing person was Catherine O'Brien, Mary Whitmore's sister from Ireland, who had been living with the family as a governess and household helper. According to family records, Catherine had been present when the photograph was taken, but vanished from Salem immediately after seeing the developed image. Mitchell realized she had stumbled upon a case that combined genealogical research, photography history, and the largely undocumented experiences of Irish immigrant women in New England. Research into the Whitmore family archives revealed a household that was typical of prosperous Salem families in the 1890s. Thomas Whitmore worked as a shipping agent, capitalizing on Salem's maritime trade connections. His wife Mary had immigrated from County Cork, Ireland in 1875, marrying Thomas 2 years later. Family correspondence showed that Mary had maintained strong connections to Ireland, regularly sending money to relatives and helping family members immigrate to America. In 1897, she sponsored her younger sister Catherine's passage to Salem following a family tragedy in Ireland. Eleanor Whitmore preserved her great-grandmother's household ledgers, which documented Catherine's arrival and integration into the family. The records showed that Catherine was initially hired as a governess for the 3 Whitmore children, earning $8 per month plus room and board, a generous wage for domestic work at the time. Catherine was more than an employee, Eleanor Whitmore explained, reading from her great-grandmother's diary entries. She was family. The children adored her, and she had a special gift for caring for them. But there were signs that she was struggling with something from her past. The household records revealed unusual patterns in Catherine's behavior. Mary Whitmore noted that Catherine would often purchase extra food and supplies, claiming they were needed for the little ones. When questioned, Catherine would become distressed and insist that Patrick and Molly, names that meant nothing to the Whitmore family, required her care. Medical records from the family physician, Dr. Samuel Adams, provided additional context. In August 1898, Dr. Adams was called to examine Catherine after she'd collapsed during a family dinner. His notes described her as suffering from severe melancholia and nervous exhaustion, conditions he attributed to unresolved grief and possible brain fever. The photograph session had been arranged for October 15, 1898, intended as a formal family portrait to send to relatives in Ireland. According to Thomas Whitmore's business correspondence, the commission was expensive, $12 paid to Herman Blackwood, Salem's most respected photographer. Family letters revealed that Catherine had been excited about the photograph, seeing it as an opportunity to show her Irish relatives how well she was thriving in America. The tragic irony was that instead of providing comfort, the developed photograph would trigger the final crisis in Catherine's deteriorating mental state. Herman Blackwood was considered Salem's premier photographer in the 1890s, known for his technical precision and artistic composition. His business records, preserved in the Salem Historical Society, revealed a methodical professional who took great pride in his work and rarely encountered technical problems. The Whitmore Commission was documented in exceptional detail, partly because of the unusual results and partly because Blackwood was genuinely mystified by what had occurred. His correspondence with fellow photographers reveals a man struggling to maintain his professional reputation while confronting an inexplicable technical failure. In a letter to his colleague William Morse in Boston, dated October 22, 1898, Blackwood wrote, "I am facing the most perplexing situation of my 20-year career. The Whitmore family portrait has resulted in what can only be described as a partial exposure failure, leaving one subject almost entirely absent from the final image." Blackwood's technical notes, discovered in his studio records, showed that he had followed his standard procedures exactly. The camera was a large-format plate camera typical of the period, requiring subjects to remain motionless for approximately 30 seconds during exposure. The lighting had been carefully arranged using natural window light supplemented by reflectors. Photography experts who have examined Blackwood's notes confirm that his methods were sound and his equipment was well maintained. "There's no indication of technical error in his process," explains Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a historian specializing in 19th century photography at Boston University. "The partial disappearance of a subject while leaving only a hand visible would be extremely difficult to achieve even intentionally." Blackwood's attempts to explain the phenomenon revealed his growing desperation. He considered equipment malfunction, improper plate preparation, contaminated chemicals, and incorrect exposure timing. He even returned to the Whitmore house to recreate the exact lighting conditions, achieving perfect results with other subjects. The photographer's final conclusion, reached after weeks of investigation, was that Catherine O'Brien must have moved during the exposure in such a way that her body was not captured while her hand remained perfectly still. While this explanation satisfied neither Blackwood nor the Whitmore family, it was the only rational theory that preserved the photographer's professional credibility. Modern photographic analysis suggests that Blackwood's conclusion was likely correct, though the specific circumstances that would create such an effect remain highly unusual. Immigration records at the National Archives revealed the heartbreaking circumstances that had brought Catherine O'Brien to America. She had arrived at Ellis Island on March 12, 1897, aboard the steamship Celtic from Queenstown, Ireland, but her passage had been paid by the Irish Relief Fund of County Cork, an organization that assisted families affected by local tragedies. Irish newspaper archives, now digitized and accessible through international library systems, provided the tragic context for Catherine's emigration. The Cork Examiner from February 28, 1897, reported a devastating house fire in the village of Ballycotton that had killed Patrick O'Brien, his wife Bridget, and their two youngest children, 8-year-old Patrick Jr. and 6-year-old Molly. Catherine, age 23, had been the sole survivor, having been visiting neighbors when the fire occurred. Parish records from St. Colman's Church in Ballycotton documented the community's concern for Catherine's mental state following the tragedy. Father Michael Walsh had written in the church ledger, "Miss Catherine O'Brien continues to struggle greatly with the loss of her family. She frequently speaks of her continued responsibility to care for young Patrick and Molly, and has been found preparing meals and setting places for them at her table." The village's poor relief records, maintained by the local workhouse, showed multiple incidents where Catherine had been discovered purchasing food and supplies for 4 people despite living alone. Community members reported that she would have conversations with empty spaces where she believed her deceased siblings were present. Dr. Patricia Hennessy, a historian specializing in Irish immigration and trauma, explains that Catherine's behavior was consistent with what we now understand as complicated grief disorder. The sudden violent loss of her entire immediate family, combined with her survival guilt, created a psychological state where she couldn't accept their deaths. Dr. Hennessy notes, "The Ballycotton community, while sympathetic to Catherine's plight, eventually concluded that she needed professional care beyond what the small village could provide. The Irish Relief Fund raised money to send her to America, hoping that distance from the scene of the tragedy and the support of her sister Mary might help Catherine heal. What they couldn't have anticipated was that Catherine's trauma would follow her across the Atlantic, manifesting in increasingly concerning behaviors that would eventually lead to her disappearance from Salem." Catherine O'Brien's first year in Salem appeared to be a success story of Irish immigrant integration. Letters preserved in the Whitmore family archives show that she initially thrived in her role as governess and household helper. forming strong bonds with the three Whitmore children and contributing significantly to the household's daily operations. Mary Whitmore's diary entries from 1897 painted a picture of relief and joy at having her sister safely in America. "Catherine has brought such life to our home," she wrote in May 1897. "The children adore her Irish songs and stories, and Thomas remarks daily on how much easier our household runs with her capable assistance." However, subtle signs of Catherine's underlying trauma began to emerge as she settled into Salem life. Local merchant records, preserved in the Essex Institute's archives, showed unusual purchasing patterns. Catherine would regularly buy extra food, children's clothing, and household supplies, beyond what the Whitmore family required. Dr. Samuel Adams, the family physician, was first called to examine Catherine in November 1897 after Mary Whitmore expressed concern about her sister's behavior. His medical notes described Catherine as physically healthy but exhibiting signs of nervous exhaustion and persistent melancholia. The situation deteriorated throughout 1898. St. Mary's Catholic Church records show that Catherine attended daily Mass and spent hours in prayer, often speaking aloud to what appeared to be empty space beside her in the pews. Father Patrick O'Brien, no relation to Catherine, noted his concern about her mental state in the parish records. Salem police records, discovered in the city archives, documented several incidents where Catherine was found in the town common late at night, apparently caring for children who weren't there. Officer Michael Sullivan reported in September 1898, found Miss O'Brien arranging what appeared to be a picnic for multiple children, though she was entirely alone. When questioned, she insisted that Patrick and Molly were hungry and required feeding. The Whitmore family's correspondence reveals their growing concern and confusion about Catherine's behavior. They consulted multiple physicians and clergy members, seeking advice on how to help her. The prevailing medical understanding of the time attributed her condition to female hysteria and Irish temperament, offering little useful guidance. By October 1898, the situation had become untenable. Thomas Whitmore's business letters mentioned the strain Catherine's condition was placing on the household, while Mary's diary entries express heartbreak at watching her beloved sister struggle with invisible demons. The family portrait session was intended as a positive distraction, a way to create a happy memory and demonstrate to Irish relatives that Catherine was thriving in America. October 15, 1898, began as a typical autumn morning in Salem. Herman Blackwood arrived at the Whitmore residence at 10 a.m., as documented in his appointment book, carrying his large-format camera equipment and glass plates. The session had been carefully planned, with the family wearing their finest clothing, and the parlor arranged to showcase their prosperity. Blackwood's technical notes, preserved in his studio archives, recorded the setup in meticulous detail. Natural light from the large parlor windows was supplemented by carefully positioned mirrors and white fabric reflectors. The camera was mounted on a heavy wooden tripod, positioned to capture the entire family arrangement. According to Blackwood's account, Catherine was initially cooperative and seemed pleased to be included in the family portrait. She was positioned standing behind young Margaret Whitmore, with her hands resting protectively on the child's shoulders, a common pose for secondary family members in formal portraits of the period. However, witness accounts from the Whitmore family, recorded in later police statements, revealed that Catherine's behavior during the session was concerning. Mary Whitmore reported that Catherine kept turning to speak to empty spaces on either side of her, apparently addressing children who weren't present. Catherine kept saying, "Stand still, Molly," and "Patrick, mind your posture," Mary Whitmore told police. She was arranging invisible children as if they were part of our family portrait. Mr. Blackwood was patient, but clearly confused by her behavior. Thomas Whitmore's account, given to Dr. Adams several days later, provided additional details. Catherine had insisted that the photographer wait while she helped Patrick straighten his collar and smoothed Molly's dress. The session, which should have taken 30 minutes, stretched to nearly 2 hours as Catherine repeatedly adjusted the positions of children only she could see. Blackwood's professional training required him to work with difficult clients, so he waited patiently while Catherine completed her mysterious arrangements. His notes indicate that he began the exposure process once Catherine appeared settled and the visible family members were properly positioned. The 30-second exposure proceeded normally, with all subjects remaining appropriately still. Blackwood recorded no technical problems during the session itself, and the family paid his fee immediately upon completion. It wasn't until the glass plates were developed 3 days later that the impossible became apparent. Catherine O'Brien had somehow vanished from the photograph, leaving only her hand visible on Margaret's shoulder. When Herman Blackwood delivered the developed photographs to the Whitmore family on October 18, 1898, he was prepared to explain what he assumed was a technical failure. However, the family's reaction was far more dramatic than he had anticipated, particularly Catherine's response to seeing her near-complete absence from the image. Mary Whitmore's diary entry from that day, written in shaking handwriting, captured the moment. Catherine became hysterical upon seeing the photograph. She insisted that Patrick and Molly were visible in the image, pointing to empty spaces and demanding to know why we couldn't see them. When we explained that she herself was barely visible, she collapsed entirely. Dr. Samuel Adams was summoned immediately. His medical report, filed with the Essex County Medical Society, described Catherine as suffering from acute nervous shock and complete disconnection from present reality. She had become catatonic, unable or unwilling to respond to her family's attempts at comfort. The photograph itself became the focus of Catherine's deteriorating mental state. According to witness accounts, she spent hours staring at the image, tracing the empty spaces with her finger and speaking to the people she believed were present but invisible to others. Father Patrick O'Brien from St. Mary's Church was called to provide spiritual comfort. His report to the bishop, preserved in the diocesan archives, revealed the depth of Catherine's psychological crisis. Miss O'Brien appears to exist in two realities simultaneously: the present world where her siblings are deceased, and an alternate reality where they remain alive and dependent upon her care. Thomas Whitmore's business correspondence from this period shows his growing desperation to help his sister-in-law while protecting his own family from the psychological trauma of witnessing her breakdown. He consulted with physicians in Boston and even considered having Catherine committed to the Danvers State Hospital. However, Catherine made the decision for them. On the night of October 18th, she packed her few belongings and left a brief note for the family. "I must take Patrick and Molly somewhere safe, where people can see them as clearly as I do. Thank you for your kindness, but we cannot stay where we are not welcome." By morning, Catherine O'Brien had vanished from Salem entirely, leaving behind only the mysterious photograph and a family forever changed by their encounter with the devastating effects of unresolved trauma. The Whitmore family never heard from Catherine again, despite extensive efforts to locate her through Irish community networks and church organizations throughout New England. Following Catherine's disappearance, the Whitmore family launched an immediate search effort that would continue for months. Thomas Whitmore contacted police departments throughout New England, while Mary reached out to Irish community organizations and Catholic churches in major cities where Catherine might have sought refuge. Salem Police Department records, preserved in the city archives, documented the official investigation. Detective Patrick Murphy, no relation to Father O'Brien, interviewed family members, neighbors, and local merchants who had known Catherine. His reports painted a picture of a deeply troubled woman whose behavior had become increasingly erratic in the weeks before her disappearance. The investigation revealed that Catherine had withdrawn her modest savings, $47, from the First National Bank of Salem on October 17th, the day before she disappeared. Bank records showed she had requested the money in small bills, suggesting she was planning a journey but wanted to avoid drawing attention. Railroad ticket agent Michael O'Sullivan at Salem Station reported selling a ticket to Boston to a young woman matching Catherine's description on the morning of October 19th. However, his account was puzzling. He claimed to have sold 3 tickets, 1 adult fare and 2 children's fares, to the same woman, despite seeing no children with her. She insisted she needed passage for herself and 2 little ones, O'Sullivan told police. When I asked where the children were, she pointed to empty spaces beside her and said they were shy strangers. I thought perhaps she was purchasing tickets for children who would join her later, so I completed the sale. Boston police were notified, and Detective James Flanagan of the South Boston Precinct took up the search. His investigation, documented in Boston Police Department files, traced Catherine to the Irish immigrant neighborhoods around South Boston, where she had sought shelter at St. Augustine's Catholic Church. Father Thomas Murphy's parish records showed that Catherine had indeed arrived in Boston on October 19th, requesting assistance and temporary housing. She had been provided with a small room in the church's charitable lodging facility, where she remained for several months. However, even in Boston, Catherine's behavior continued to deteriorate. Parish records documented numerous incidents where she was found preparing meals for multiple people despite living alone, purchasing children's clothing with her limited funds, and engaging in conversations with invisible companions. The final documented sighting of Catherine O'Brien came from Dr. James Whitmore, a Boston physician who specialized in mental disorders. He examined Catherine in March 1899 at the request of Father Murphy, who was concerned about her deteriorating condition. Dr. James Whitmore's medical assessment of Catherine O'Brien, dated March 15, 1899, provided the clearest clinical picture of her condition that exists in the historical record. His report, filed with the Massachusetts Medical Society, described Catherine as suffering from what he termed chronic melancholia, with hallucinatory manifestations. Miss O'Brien presents with a complete inability to accept the reality of her siblings' deaths, Dr. Whitmore wrote. She has constructed an elaborate alternate reality in which Patrick and Molly remain alive and dependent upon her care. This delusion has become so complete that she perceives their presence as physical reality. Dr. Whitmore recommended immediate institutionalization at McLean Hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts, then considered the most progressive facility for treating mental disorders. However, Catherine disappeared from her Boston lodgings on March 18, 1899, before the arrangements could be completed. Boston police records show that Catherine was last seen walking toward Boston Harbor in the early morning hours of March 19, 1899. Dock worker Timothy Sullivan reported seeing a young woman who matched her description standing at the end of Long Wharf, apparently speaking to companions he couldn't see. She was gesturing as if helping children, telling them not to be afraid, Sullivan told police. But she was completely alone out there. When I called out to ask if she needed assistance, she turned and smiled, then walked into the fog. By the time I reached the spot, she was gone. Despite extensive searches of the harbor and surrounding areas, Catherine O'Brien was never found. She was officially declared missing by Boston authorities on April 1, 1899, becoming one of thousands of Irish immigrants whose fates were lost to the challenges of 19th-century urban life. Father Murphy preserved Catherine's few belongings, including a letter she had written but never sent to her sister Mary. In it, she wrote, "Please understand that I must take Patrick and Molly somewhere we can be together properly. They have been so patient, waiting for me to find the right place for our family." The letter concluded, "Tell the photographer that his camera captured the truth. I am disappearing from this world because I belong in another one, where the children I love are still alive and still need me." Catherine's fate remains unknown, but her story provides a window into the psychological trauma experienced by many Irish immigrants who fled not just poverty, but profound personal tragedies that followed them to America. More than 125 years after the mysterious photograph was taken, modern experts have developed a clearer understanding of both the technical and psychological factors that created this unusual historical artifact. The case of Catherine O'Brien and the Whitmore family portrait has become a subject of study for historians, psychologists, and photography experts interested in the intersection of trauma and visual documentation. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a photography historian at Boston University, has analyzed Herman Blackwood's techniques and concluded that the partial disappearance of Catherine from the image was likely the result of her movement during the long exposure time. Victorian photography required subjects to remain perfectly still for 30 seconds or more. Dr. Walsh explains, "If Catherine moved her body while keeping one hand stationary, it could create exactly the effect captured in the photograph. This technical explanation gains credibility when considered alongside witness accounts of Catherine's behavior during the session. Her apparent interactions with invisible children would have caused significant movement, while her protective hand on Margaret Whitmore's shoulder may have remained steady throughout the exposure." Dr. Patricia Hennessy, who has studied Irish immigrant trauma, places Catherine's story in the broader context of 19th century mental health understanding. Catherine was suffering from what we now recognize as complicated grief disorder, possibly combined with post-traumatic stress disorder, she explains. The sudden, violent loss of her entire family created psychological symptoms that 1890s medicine couldn't properly diagnose or treat. The photograph itself has become part of the Whitmore family legacy, eventually donated to the Salem Historical Society, where it serves as a powerful reminder of the human cost of immigration and trauma. Sarah Mitchell's research has helped preserve Catherine's story for future historians studying Irish-American experiences. Eleanor Whitmore, now 90, reflects on her family's connection to Catherine with a mixture of sadness and understanding. For over a century, we thought of that photograph as just a strange family curiosity, she says. Now we understand it as evidence of a tragedy, a young woman so devastated by loss that she couldn't exist fully in our world anymore. The case has also contributed to historical research on photography's role in documenting psychological trauma. The image captures not just a technical anomaly, but a moment when grief manifested visually, creating a permanent record of Catherine's struggle to exist between the world of the living and her memories of the dead. Catherine O'Brien's fate remains unknown, but her story has found its place in history as a testament to the power of loss, the limits of 19th century understanding of mental health, and the ways that trauma can literally disappear people from the world around them, leaving only traces of their presence behind.